Mr. Chairman, fellow panelists, members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. May I begin by congratulating the Association for Political Economy of the University of Colombo and Sri Lanka, Inc. for their initiative in organizing what I consider to be an exceedingly timely seminar on a topic of urgent public importance to our country today. It is quite obvious as we discuss the topic of constitution making, reconciliation and the public, that the entire process of constitutional reform is grinding to a halt, or at least slowing down substantially. Something that began with a great deal of promise is seen to be almost petering out. I think it will be useful to begin by examining the reasons for this phenomenon. I don't think the reasons are entirely related to legal or constitutional issues. The present situation has to be evaluated and understood in a broader social context. Emperor Napoleon once said that for a government to be able to embark upon intrinsically difficult things, that government must enjoy great stature and the confidence of the public in abundant measure. Today, the reluctance to hold a referendum in particular derives from a number of factors, very few of which are directly related to the substance and content of the proposed constitution. I think the truth is that the government does not have the confidence that the people will endorse what they put before the country. One of the main reasons for this is the widespread perception that this is a corrupt government, possibly the most corrupt since independence. Venerable Bellangvilla Vimalaratna Thero encapsulated this when, in the presence of His Excellency President Maithripala Sirisena at Abherama, he said, even a small child in this country would understand the magnitude of the fraud that was perpetrated in relation to the central bank. So we have a series of such horrendous frauds. There is the unprecedented problem at the central bank. Then we had the Supreme Court of the country, a bench presided over by the Chief Justice, in atypical language. That is not the normal style of a judgment. But the Chief Justice observed that the conscience of the court is shaken by what the court was told with regard to the coal tender. Then you have a situation where there's a great deal of trumpeting by a massive investment on the part of Volkswagen to discover Volkswagen is not related to this transaction at all, and the land that is given to a private company is land which has been bestowed on the public trustee by a testamentary disposition by a philanthropist who specifically set up a charitable trust in perpetuity in the names of himself and his wife, and directed the public trustee to ensure that the income derived from the plantation be utilized in order to provide free medicines for indigent patients. Then you have the Horana situation, the tire factory in the heart of Horana, land available for the lease rent of 100 rupees per acre a year. One could go on. So there is definitely the strong public perception that this is a dishonest, corrupt government, and all of these factors are bound to play in the public mind when it comes to voting at a referendum. We all know from empirical experience in different jurisdictions that people, when called upon to vote at a referendum, do not address themselves exclusively or even primarily to the content of a constitution, to the terms of the specific question that has been asked. It is often looked upon as an opportunity to express satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the government in power. General Charles de Gaulle held a referendum on a relatively insignificant matter relating to local government in France. His problem was running into formidable problems at that time. And General de Gaulle very foolishly said, if I lose this referendum, I will go home. And a man who had rendered such distinguished service to France had to abide by that promise, and that was the end of his public career. The referenda recently conducted in the United Kingdom and in Italy also bear testimony to the truth, to the reality that people use a referendum to express their views on a wide range of issues connected with the popularity and the acceptability of the incumbent administration. So there is this reluctance to hold a referendum. Now, another factor which has a fundamental bearing on the topics that we are discussing this evening is the total lack of clarity with regard to what is proposed by the government. Nobody knows. Certainly, I do not have the vaguest conception of what it is that the government is proposing. It all begins with President Maithripala Sirisena's manifesto, where he very clearly said that he wants a mandate from the people of this country to carry out those constitutional reforms which do not require the holding of a referendum. In other words, he imposed upon himself a certain limitation on the parameters and the scope of the proposed constitutional reforms. His position was that he would undertake only those reforms which are capable of being effected with a two-thirds majority in Parliament, but without the legal necessity of holding and winning a referendum. As we all know, any amendment of the Constitution requires a two-thirds majority. Any amendment at all. However, Article 83 of the Constitution declares that with respect to 10 particular provisions, those provisions can be changed not just with a two-thirds majority in Parliament, but also with the support of the people declared at a referendum. So there are particular provisions of the Constitution which are entrenched in that manner. They are sacrosanct and cannot be amended simply by a two-thirds majority in the legislature. So President Sirisena at that time seemed to be saying, I mean, this was prior to election, he will not touch those provisions. Those will remain intact. He will deal only with the rest of the Constitution, which is amenable to change by having recourse simply to a two-thirds majority in Parliament. So that seemed to be the position at that time. Subsequently, he has made conflicting and contradicting statements at different times. The most dramatic and emotional statement of the latter category was the statement that he made to the nation standing by the body of the late priest Madhulave Sobita. I listened to it myself on television. In very emotional terms, he told the people of this country, here is this great reformer, this priest, who left his temple, the Nagavihari, in order to embark upon a hazardous adventure. And the aim, the objective of the priest was to secure the abolition of the executive presidency. That is what the priest was striving indefatigably for. The president went on to declare, regrettably, the priest is no longer with us, but his inspiration is very much there, and I pledge now here before his body that I will continue the struggle which he initiated, and I will ensure the abolition of the executive presidency. So now, where do we stand? The abolition of the executive presidency, of course, requires a referendum. Nobody will suggest that it can be done with a two-thirds majority. But it is not only that. There are fundamental divergences of opinion within the government. Of course, in any government, in any political party, there will be nuances and gradations of opinion. If it were otherwise, it would be very strange. It would be a subversion of human nature. But you cannot even begin to undertake a serious process of constitutional reform unless there is a consensus with regard to basics. Now, that is exactly what is lacking. If you look at statements that are made every day by leaders of the government, they simply cannot be reconciled one with the other. Powerful personalities in the Sri Lanka Freedom Party are saying there is no mandate for a completely new constitution, nor do we need one. All that is required is to address certain burning issues, specific matters, which can be adequately catered for by means of a 20th amendment. These ministers have gone on to identify the particular problems which, in their opinion, require an urgent solution, not by means of a fully fledged constitution, but by introducing in Parliament amendments directed towards particular reforms. The principal area which, according to them, is in urgent need of reform are elections, the modalities, the system that we are going to use. First past the post, or proportional representation, or a hybrid system incorporating elements derived from both systems. That can, of course, be done by the 20th Amendment. Indeed, during the 100-day period when I was also a member of Parliament, I distinctly remember when there was great reluctance on the part of some members of Parliament to support the 19th Amendment. We were told, in no uncertain terms, have no inhibitions in your mind, support the 19th Amendment. Very shortly, within a few weeks, we will present to you the 20th Amendment on electoral reform. It was subject to that understanding that members of Parliament, many of them whom I know very well, agreed to support the 19th Amendment at all. So, this body of opinion holds, let's address in earnest issues connected with electoral reform, the executive presidency, and some aspects of devolution. But that does not necessarily mean that we need to reject in toto the existing constitution and replace it with an entirely new constitution. That appears to be the thinking among the majority of the members of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party that are an integral part of the government. The United National Party appears to have a completely different view. They are for a totally new constitution. They are for the holding of a referendum. The leader of the House, the Honorable Lakshman Kiriyal, unequivocally declared, with the support of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, we will hold and win a referendum. Barely 48 hours later, the Honorable John Senaviratna contradicted this and said the Sri Lanka Freedom Party does not support the holding of a referendum and must not be relied upon for any kind of support for the holding of a referendum. So you can readily see that this amounts to a mass of confusion. What is being proposed? New constitution or changes to the existing constitution? Changes which are restricted to provisions which are not protected by Article 83, or changes which straddle the whole area, including the entrenched provisions. What is the position regarding the executive presidency? President Sirisena, I remember he said in Parliament when I was there, he was standing in front of me and he was speaking. He said, I do not want these powers. the term of office of the executive president was 6 years. Now, he said this, and I distinctly remember this. He said, I want to reduce it to 4 years. But my party says that that is not sufficient to carry out the program of reform that we have in mind. Therefore, with some reluctance, I have agreed to their suggestion that it should be 5 years. But my own inclination, my preference is to reduce the period from 6 years to 4 years. Contrast that with the present position, where Ministers Faiza Mustafa and Dilan Pereira, in the presence of the President, and without any contradiction or expression of disapproval or disagreement on the part of the President, says the presidency will remain. And what is more, Mr. Maithripala Sirisena will be our candidate next time as well. Not only that, the amazing argument is now propounded that President Sirisena's term is going to be 6 years. He says, I wanted it to be 4. You forced me to accept 5. Now it's going to be 6 again, according to his own ministers. Now that is not a tenable proposition at all. Mr. Manohar Reddy Silva, President's Counsel, had expressed his views on that matter. And his arguments are incontrovertible. On the face of the 19th Amendment, it is very clear that President Sirisena's term is 5 years and not 6 years. So in the midst of all this, who wants what? What is the truth? What is camouflage? Now this is one of the main problems with regard to the process of constitutional reform today in this country. It is totally lacking in clarity and credibility. Government is asking other political parties to present their views without making it at all clear to Parliament and to the country what it is that the government itself is proposing, at least in the form of the essentials. Then there's also the problem of simulation, of hypocrisy. I mean, there are political parties which openly say we have serious reservations about the unitary state, about other provisions in the Constitution. But that is not the view government is telling us. Of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party and the United National Party, what passes for the official Sri Lanka Freedom Party says no. We think that Article 2 is sacred, should not be touched at all. So I am strongly committed to that position. But take even a superficial look at the report of the Parliamentary Committee on Centre-Periphery Relations. There are some far-reaching recommendations that are contained in that report. This is not the time to embark on a detailed study of the Constitution and to go into technical matters, but I will content myself by referring to this matter, which is absolutely basic. It has to do with the role, the constitutional role of governors of provinces. Under the existing constitution, the governor is the alter ego of the president. He is the representative of the president in the relevant part of the country. It is now proposed in the report on Centre-Periphery Relations that the governor should be responsible not to the president but to the chief minister and to the board of ministers. Today, the governor has the power to do, he has a series of options with regard to legislation that is passed by a provincial council. He can endorse it, or if he has doubts in his mind about the legality of what has been done, he can then hold it up, refer it to the president with a request that it be submitted to the Supreme Court for a constitutional interpretation on the whole question of vires, whether the purported statute is really within the ambit of authority conferred by the Constitution on the provincial council. Now, these are all decisions which the governor is required to make independently, as the representative of the president. Now that is being overhauled completely. That's being overhauled completely, and he becomes subordinate to the chief minister. Then the provincial secretariats, the divisional secretariats, all of that functions under the provincial council. That makes a fundamental change, because the basic nexus between the president and the governor is what enables the president to exercise his authority all over the country. So then to effect those reforms and still to maintain that Sri Lanka remains a unitary state is disingenuous. It is hypocritical, because it is unitary in name but not in substance. Now, because of the time constraint, I will just make a few brief remarks on the subject of reconciliation. Of course, reconciliation is something that we all need very badly at the conclusion of a ferocious 30-year conflict. But there are two things I would like to mention to you about reconciliation. There's a very valuable passage in the teachings of the Buddha, where the Buddha says, when you have had an excruciatingly painful past with regard to a certain matter, and you are now determined to forge ahead with your life, do not dwell on that problem in such a way as to perpetuate the pain and the anguish. Move on. The second consideration is, of course, reconciliation means that you have to be fair to minorities, but there must also be a certain threshold of comfort in the minds of the majority community. Now, that is not there at the moment. The manner in which armed forces are required to be dealt with by some of the proposals that have been made, war crimes, the creation of new offences, retrospective operation of those offences, where all that fails, weeding out elements of the armed forces by administrative means. We now have a situation where there's credible evidence of an attempt on the life of a member of parliament, Mr. Sumandiran. I was asking about that. There is a wealth of detail in an article which was published 3 days ago by Mr. D.B.S. Jairaj in the Mirror. Now, I know that the TNA does not agree with this, but in my view, it is anomalous for the 5 suspects in that case to be dealt with under the normal law when they are produced in the courts in Kilinochchi. If the Prevention of Terrorism Act has any application at all, surely it must be applied in that situation. Look at the evidence which is being unearthed by the TID. A very sophisticated and orchestrated attempt involving sources from 4 countries. Then the suspects, according to that article, are strongly resisting through their lawyers any attempt to be taken to the places where ammunition, weapons are thought to be buried. Now, the whole purpose of the PTA is to enable you to deal with those situations. But on the 16th of December, the Prime Minister had a meeting with the representatives of the European Union, 7 ambassadors, and 6 ambassadors and 1 High Commissioner. And the Prime Minister is promising these representatives that the PTA will be repealed, fundamental changes will be made in the Public Security Ordinance and so on. All of this creates a certain impression, not just in the majority community, but in the country at large, that this is no way. I mean, the terrorism is never extinguished finally and irrevocably. A military victory does not mean that the country is safe forever thereafter. In light of these trends which are now manifesting themselves in a very disturbing way, there is a real fear that the country, that the present government is unduly friendly to these forces, coming down very hard on the armed forces, on the intelligence. The PTA is being used against intelligence officials, but not against terrorist suspects. All of that appears to be lacking in a sense of balance and does not engender the kind of confidence that is required for a successful reconciliation process. So these are my basic thoughts on the matter, and I thank the organizers of this seminar for the courtesy that they have extended to me by inviting me to address you on this occasion. Thank you very much indeed.
Sri Lanka Incorporated.